like to welcome everyone. I'd like to give everyone a warm welcome to today's IFOA sessional meeting, where the Financial Literacy Working Party will be presenting. My name's Rob Merry, and I'm a member of the IFOA Life Board and the Lifelong Learning Committee, and I will be chairing today's meeting. I would like to welcome you all to what promises to be a very interesting and timely presentation. As COVID-19 continues to make radical changes to our lives and economies, financial literacy is going to be a key skill for many people as more and more people's livelihoods are dramatically changed. And for those in the UK, it's a particularly timely session, as last week a very famous commentator and advocate for financial literacy, Martin Lewis, presented a 1-hour TV programme on this very subject matter. And probably the timing of that is due to its importance. I'm pleased to see so many people join us today, with over 290 people booking to join. One of the advantages of having to use virtual meetings is improved geographic access to IFOA webinars. And today we have people from all corners of the globe, from Canada, where they're just starting their day, across to Europe, Middle East and Africa, and on to Asia, and in particular Australia, where their day is ending or has already ended. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of virtual sessions is how we need to deal with questions. I would encourage you all to raise questions using the Q&A box on your screens, and I will use these to raise questions at the end of the session on your behalf. However, if your specific question is not covered, you can forward that to the IFOA and we will ask the Working Party to directly respond to you. I'd like to welcome the speakers today. First off, I would like to welcome Chris Bernard. Chris is a senior actuary with Allianz SE in Munich, Germany, with over 25 years of experience in the insurance industry. Chris has worked in product development, pensions, finance and business steering areas with a current focus on customer value initiatives. Chris has held several overseas appointed actuary roles and is a member of the IFOA Life Research Committee. And joining Chris today, we have Danny Brotherston. Danny is currently Head of Advice, Policy and Development at St James's Place, where she is responsible for overseeing and developing the firm's advice proposition. Previously, Danny's worked for Mercer's in the Retirement and Investment Consulting Division. Danny is a graduate of Cambridge University, having completed a Master's in Engineering and also holds an MSc from Imperial College. Danny is an actuary and certified enterprise risk actuary and sits on several IFOA working parties. So welcome both Chris and Danny, and I'd like to hand you now over to Chris, who will start the presentation.
Thank you, Rob. Go to slide 2, please. So, good evening and welcome. It's a pleasure to be presenting at this virtual sessional meeting. My name is Chris Barnard and I joined the Financial Literacy Working Party as I've been heavily involved in fixing many problems involving customers' misunderstanding of insurance products in my day job, where I am head of actuarial within a global life insurance function. Our working party was set up in 2018 to research, firstly, existing levels of financial literacy. Secondly, what are useful mechanisms that could help to improve financial literacy? And thirdly, an overall approach that could improve the financial literacy of the general public. We have been able to draw from a broad range of experience and perspectives, from consulting, professionalism, education and research, and of course, life insurance and pensions. From Tony in Ireland, to myself in Germany, and to Danny, Peter, Jonathan Billing and Jonathan Wright in the UK. We have presented some preliminary thoughts at the 2018 Life Conference and have worked since then on refining the research to a point where we are ready to present our ideas today and start engaging in more formal discussions. We will start by looking at the current situation, why the profession should get involved, and why we decided to consider so-called vulnerable customers as a very special case. Then we will briefly discuss some of our proposals and their implications before outlining some next steps and finally wrapping up. May we move to slide 4, please. The current level of financial literacy in the general public is shockingly low. We have shown that this is the case not just in the UK, but also worldwide. In an opinion piece for City AM, past president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, Jane Curtis, has said that financial literacy for most of the UK remains poor. We have a large savings gap and a lack of trust in the financial services industry. These problems are exacerbated by gaps in the public's economic knowledge, including how much is required to provide their expected pensions, and confusion on how financial products work. Just highlighting some of the consequences of this on the slide. Poor financial literacy can lead to incorrect financial planning and a savings gap, a lack of trust in financial services, and the very damaging psychological issues of a feeling of helplessness in times of financial stress and financial exclusion. Jane Curtis goes on to mention some of the benefits of improving financial literacy as a more financially literate consumer is more likely to buy the right products at the right time for the right job and to avoid being missold to or failing to make sufficient provision for his or her future. Regarding improving financial literacy, the Financial Services Authority stated even earlier in 2003 that never has the need been so great or so urgent. The Working Party fully endorses these views. And move to the next slide, please. So why should the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries get more involved in this topic? Well, surely having a more financially literate public would be beneficial for the financial services industry, including insurance and pensions. Perhaps it would help to reduce the frequency of mis-selling and dissatisfied customers, and to improve the very poor reputation of financial service companies, all of which is good for us. Importantly, the IFOA as a profession has a good reputation. We understand the topic well, and it would be difficult to argue that improving financial literacy was not in the public interest. Finally, we have many touch points as a profession across industry and society, with financial companies, industry bodies, regulators, education and research bodies, and the government. And our voice still counts for something with these parties. If we can move forward, please. But perhaps we are overselling the importance of financial literacy. After all, improved financial literacy surely cannot be the solution to all of our problems. Well, let us be clear. The Working Party agrees with this, and it is very important to realise that improving financial literacy is not a silver bullet. We cannot just increase financial education and awareness and then wash our hands and imagine that the public will be able to look after themselves in all situations, particularly when buying ever more complex financial products. Improving financial literacy makes sense most of all in the context of a financial environment that can be navigated reasonably and fairly by as many people as possible. Perhaps the best way of thinking about this is to consider both absolute and relative measures of financial literacy. We can all agree, surely, that it would be good if everyone was a bit more financially literate. For example, if the bell curve of financial literacy outcomes, a so-called financial literacy IQ, was absolutely shifted to the right. But that would still leave millions of people on the left of this distribution who would be relatively less financially literate and relatively less financially capable, many to the extent that they could actually start being termed vulnerable customers. Such vulnerability would definitely increase in the context of buying insurance products, for example, because of the increasing complexity of our products and the asymmetry of information that exists between insurance companies, distributors, and the customer. The Working Party really struggled with this point, and ultimately we felt that we should expand the scope of our research to allow for this as best as we could. So in the end, we decided to address the topic of vulnerable customers as a priority within our research, as we shall shortly see. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, how do we propose to improve financial literacy? Now, before I jump into the specifics, I just wanted to set the scene around the importance of education. So as shown on the next slide, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, bit of a mouthful, so let's just call them the OECD for short, are advocates of improved financial literacy. And through a number of studies they have carried out, they've highlighted some concerning findings. For example, they found that on average, fewer than half of adults achieve the minimum target score on financial knowledge. And furthermore, around 1 in 4 students are unable to make even simple decisions on everyday spending, while only 1 in 10 can understand complex issues such as income tax. They recognise the importance of focusing on financial literacy from a young age, and that the provision of high quality targeted financial education in schools and throughout life is essential to develop knowledge and skills. Now, we as a Working Party fully support this and believe that in a frequently changing marketplace, consumers of all ages can really benefit from ongoing financial education. Because ultimately, financial literacy is a lifelong requirement that will vary for individuals at different life stages. And so information and education needs to be targeted and age appropriate. So moving on to the next slide. It probably comes as no surprise, therefore, that our first key conclusion is around financial education. As Chris said, improved financial education is not a silver bullet, but it must be part of a series of measures to help consumers make better choices and in turn improve financial outcomes. Now, given the evidence we found around the low levels of financial literacy and how they are scarcely improving, this is an area that we believe has to be taken seriously. Now, research shows that students exposed to financial education are more likely to display positive financial behaviours. And actually, most financial habits and attitudes towards money are formed as early as the age of 7. And for these reasons, we concluded that financial education should be mandatory in the school curriculum, and it needs to start at primary school. And this is something that was also supported by the House of Lords Select Committee on Financial Exclusion. Now, simply adding this to the curriculum, however, is unlikely to make the improvements needed. We must go further and ensure that schools are not only adequately resourced, but have teachers who have received specialist financial education training. And that last point is really important because other research shows that this additional step really helps with the motivation of students, which in turn improves their engagement on the subject. Now, while schools have a really important part to play in this space, financial education can't just stop when someone leaves. It needs to continue to be made available throughout someone's life. But how do we go about doing this? There's clearly a need for some new and creative thinking here, and some sources that we've put forward that could provide a role in this space include public service broadcasters, other media, regulators, industry bodies, to name but a few. Now, if we move to the next slide, as Chris alluded to, whilst we quickly realised that improved levels of and access to financial education is valuable in itself, it's also important to have delivery mechanisms and content that target specific audiences, vulnerable groups in particular. Now, the definition of a vulnerable customer is someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to detriment, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. Now, vulnerable groups of people are most at risk of making poor financial decisions, and this could have negative consequences on a whole range of things, from savings and debt levels through to retirement and financial inclusion more generally. Now, whilst it's not a new concept, it is one that is rising in importance against a backdrop of an ageing society and the impacts data use could have on financial exclusion. And financial firms should be expected to take particular care to ensure that vulnerable customers are treated fairly, as they may be more likely to experience harm. Now, although measuring vulnerability is subjective, the lower the level of financial literacy and the more complex the financial product, the more vulnerable is the customer. And for this reason, great care is needed with complex products, and they should be designed for a specific target market and customer need. Now, whilst we're on the topic of complex products, despite certain rules being brought in to protect consumers, inappropriate financial products continue to be promoted, and so we believe that the FCA ought to make earlier use of its early intervention powers. Moving on to the next slide, another of our key conclusions was to introduce a mandatory product certification on all retail financial products. Now, we felt that a named actuarial risk or compliance specialist of sufficient standing should be required to certify that product terms and conditions and marketing information presented to customers is fair, not misleading, and understandable to the target market. Now, this product certification should ideally be a principles-based requirement, rather than one based on a set of fixed rules that would potentially need to be amended or modified over time. Now, this named specialist would be responsible for the framework for evidencing the certification and would need to be able to defend such certification if challenged to do so. We could imagine that certain products that meet specific requirements for simplicity and understandability could be kite-marked, which would allow an easier product certification based on a safe harbour concept for such products. Now, further research into this concept of a stronger product certification regime would clearly be required, but the Working Party would be supportive of this and believe that the actuarial profession is ideally placed to contribute to or even take a lead in this research. Now, finally, on the next slide, the Working Party would also support the introduction of a duty of care on financial firms through regulation, which would require them to exercise reasonable care and skill when providing a product or service. This is not a new concept and already exists in other markets, and again is something that was also recommended by the House of Lords Select Committee on Financial Exclusion. Now, if this was introduced, firms would be required to anticipate customer detriment and give greater emphasis on meeting the needs of customers. We expect that this would then reduce the likelihood of mis-selling and the need for regulatory intervention. Now, there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages in introducing a duty of care, and some argue that a legal obligation on firms may discourage innovation and reduce the complexity of products. However, we believe that if a firm's culture is set up to ensure that the duty of care is driven throughout the organisation, then this should actually lead to a reduction in the amount of compliance already in existence within a firm. Furthermore, the introduction of a duty of care would increase opportunities for firms to innovate and compete without the unnecessary burden currently required by compliance with a number of rules, all intended to achieve the single purpose of fair treatment of customers. Ultimately, We believe that introducing this duty of care would build trust between a firm and its customers, which in turn should improve the level of trustworthiness in the market, something that is desperately needed. So, moving on to the next slide, what are the implications of our proposals? And then the next slide. We strongly feel that our recommendations will deliver multiple benefits, both generally, but also for the vulnerable amongst us. Now, the benefits of taking action to improve financial literacy are clear. If we raise financially capable consumers, they will know when and how financial institutions can help them. They'll be less prone to buying products that don't suit their needs and more inclined to engage proactively with the financial services sector. Simply put, people who understand their financial circumstances and are well versed in personal finance are more likely to make sensible choices and adequate provision for their futures. They'll also feel less helpless in times of financial stress. In addition, because a capable customer is a less vulnerable one, this should mean that, over time, regulators will have less need to intervene with detailed rules in the retail market. Now, there is one thing that still remains to be said. There is no magic bullet to solve all of the issues raised. We hope, however, that the research and ideas presented in our paper will help the profession take the next step in making improvements in this area. Chris, back to you.
Move on to the next slide. I think you have to skip one slide and go to the next slide. Thank you. In our paper, we outlined some fundamental principles of managing money as a framework for helping financial literacy. This was intended as an initial discussion piece, and we acknowledged that there would be challenges to be overcome in agreeing content, presentation, and wording, and in achieving consistency with other areas of our profession's principles and practices. One of the main reasons for doing this was to raise our voice as a profession in order to increase awareness of the importance of basic financial literacy. Another reason was to stimulate and engage in debate on what the profession can do in the future to help improve financial outcomes for our customers. We decided to focus on 5 principles, which include the following: plan for spending, plan for emergencies, plan for borrowing, plan for saving, and plan for advice. We do believe that the profession has much to offer and believe that there should be an emphasis on what we see as traditional actuarial strengths of attention to risk and return, certainty and uncertainty, and that these principles can be applied beyond the traditional actuarial domain of longer-term financial planning. The Working Party would be grateful for your feedback and suggestions on these financial principles, either during this meeting or by email at any time. We move forward, please. We've mentioned a couple of times that we should increase the profession's voice and presence in this area. We believe that the profession has a duty to advocate for improved financial literacy, and that this topic is in the public interest and in the interest of the profession as a whole. To this end, we recommend that the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries should establish a permanent financial literacy practice area, panel or member interest group that can act as a supporting voice, a sounding board, and a trusted partner with suitable organizations that are active in this area. We would also suggest that there should be at least 2 sub-areas that would focus on, firstly, vulnerable customers, and secondly, women's financial literacy, as unfortunately, some research indicates that women have weaker financial skills than men, even after considering variations in age, country, education, and income. Once again, we are happy to receive your feedback on these next steps. So in conclusion, the Working Party want to make it clear that financial literacy is an incredibly complex arena. And while we don't have a magic bullet to solve all of the issues that we raise, we demonstrate how financial literacy levels and the protection of vulnerable customers could be improved if the ideas and conclusions of our research are followed. And we look forward to working together and continuing to make a contribution in some of these key areas mentioned. Thank you for your time. Back over to you, Rob.
And thank you for that interesting presentation. The good news is we've had a lot of questions online, so that's encouraging. Please feel free to continue to add your questions to this subject matter. I'm sure it's something everyone has a point of view on, but we certainly have enough questions to start the ball rolling. So I guess a couple of themes from the question is around effectively adequacy of material to equip those that in the teaching profession improve the level of financial literacy. So from your perspective, have you seen any examples of good material that teachers could use? If there isn't good material, who do you think would be well placed to fill that gap and to get it into the educational process so that this specialism or aspect of teaching can be introduced competently into the teaching, into the curriculum for schools?
Well, during our research, we found that there is an abundance of resources available to help with financial literacy, from books for children and books for adults, countless websites and apps of varying levels of complexity, numerous organizations and charities that are active in this area. For example, Red Start, run by Robert Gardner, who we engaged with. And we shouldn't forget that financial education has been part of the national curriculum since 2014. We don't believe that there is a lack of resources, rather a lack of delivery and engagement with the existing resources. In some areas, we think that things can be improved. Firstly, we agree with the House of Lords that financial literacy and financial education should be added to the primary school curriculum. And secondly, if we're going to take this seriously, educating our kids in schools, then we need to make sure that we give it more care and attention, and it's not just considered a last thought behind all other subjects and all other material. Schools should provide dedicated sessions run by specially trained teachers. And that last point is really important, as Danny pointed out. Research carried out by the What Works Fund has shown that providing specialist financial education training to teachers is valuable and has a clear positive impact for teachers and students, in particular improving outcomes across students' mindset and skills. So if we're going to promote financial education in schools and make this mandatory, let's do it properly. Let's not just treat it as some kind of burden or annoyance, but at least ensure that the teachers have specialist training so that they can impart the right knowledge to our children.
I think it's a consistency thing as well, because Chris mentioned, several organisations that we came across who are doing this already and delivering really great material to children, be that in primary schools and or secondary schools. And that's great if you as a child or you as a parent, your child goes to one of those schools that engages in one of those programs. But if you don't, then you're not getting access to the same material, teaching and training that other children potentially are. So having something in the curriculum, just especially with kind of teachers that have been trained in this topic, provides that level or better level of consistency across all schools and therefore all children.
Okay, thank you. We've had quite a lot of questions around, the focus on your answer to that question is very much around financial literacy in schools and making sure that we empower our younger people so they're prepared for life. A lot of comments that we've had and questions we've had relate to how do we pass on that ability or that skill to people that are no longer going to go to school. So I guess we're talking about people in their work that are working, or in particularly those people that are retired. What opportunities do we have to and to take full advantage of improving financial literacy for those individuals? And specifically, quite a few points around from an insurance perspective. When is the best time, perhaps in the insurance selling side? Lots of people have pointed out that the point of sale is a really good opportunity for improving financial literacy. If that's logically, and I guess if that's the case, then why have we perhaps as an industry failed to do that? Or have we been doing it well?
That's a lot of questions in one question. So maybe I can go first. Maybe Dan, you can jump on and correct me when I make a mistake. So I think that, like I said before, I think there's enough material and enough resources available for people to engage with the topic. The websites that we mentioned earlier, the apps that we mentioned earlier, are available across all age ranges and all life events for retirees, as well as young kids. And there are some very specialist, I would say, websites which are funded, I believe, publicly. I may be wrong there, such as Money Advice Service, Stroke Pensions Advisory Service, which do provide very good material. I believe one of the issues is many millions of people don't really realize that there's a problem. It's a difficult one to self-analyze and self-reflect on. Most people say they're a good driver and they're a good judge of character. And probably most people think they understand enough about money and can spot a scam if it comes towards them. So there may be a feeling with many people that there's no need to engage with this topic. It's rather dull for most people. In terms of in which part of the sales process or which part of the insurance process you would like to actually engage with the customer and make them aware of the product that they're buying and understand the product that they're buying, I think ideally would be point of sale, at least for advised sales, or that can also be done for non-advised sales. But you have the various rules which have been implemented in the UK around target market, around know your customer, around providing a suitability assessment. One of the main features of the suitability assessment or factors to consider is the knowledge and experience of the customer, their ability to absorb risks and absorb losses. So I think that's an ideal place to provide some, I wouldn't say training to the customer, but to try and ensure that the customer has really understood what they've bought. And I think in some cases where you have products which are very complex, providing very highly non-linear or highly geared outcomes, such as structured notes or very complex financial instruments, I think there should be a rebuttable presumption that the customer simply doesn't understand the product unless they have a financial qualification of some kind, or an actuary, for example. So I think we have to be very careful that we not only dot the I's and cross the T's during the sales process and follow the rules and the compliance rules, but try to ensure that the customers understood what they bought, at least in terms of what they pay in, what can they get out, including the worst case scenarios.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you just said. I think ultimately it's definitely something that we need to do more of in terms of educating not just children, because I mean not just the research and the studies that we've looked at, but it's clear that people, especially when they're looking to think about their own finances, don't know enough. And how do you educate that? And I don't know the answer. I definitely think we need to really think about it. And I think part of the issue is that people don't like talking about money and their finances. I can remember reading something somewhere where people were more comfortable talking about things like sex than they were money, which seems crazy. And I think the point around a point of sale, totally agree. One of the challenges, though, is just the amount of literature and documentation you already receive at point of sale. I suspect is incredibly overwhelming for people, let alone kind of putting on the education piece on top of that. So I really think we need to think about the best way in which we position all of this stuff.
Absolutely.
And certainly in the UK, we've had BSI kite marks for those products that are explained in a way that's accessible, and we have had the Clear English Society providing feedback and giving their assurance to product literature in the industry in the UK. However, we still seem to not quite be able to get the right information across at the right time. Can you give us some examples perhaps of where the industry has failed so badly that the level of trust or the level of understanding has resulted in adverse outcomes either for firms or for the policyholder? So kind of, I guess, what is the consequence of the lack of financial literacy, particularly in relation to insurance products?
Do you want to take this, Danny, and I can jump in?
Yeah, so one thing I suppose that just jumps to my mind, I mean, you've got like, PPI scandal. I know that's kind of one sort of thing that's doing the rounds at the moment, or just coming to a close, really. But there's just this horrible level of mistrust generally with financial services, and now kind of PPI is over. I was listening to something on the radio the other day, and someone was sort of saying, "Have you invested in something and you've lost some money? Because we might be able to get some money back for you." And it's this almost this portrayal that if you invest in something, you'll purchase a financial product, that something bad's going to happen, or you shouldn't trust it because you'll have paid too much in charges, or you were invested in the wrong thing. And I think part of the reason that people take that view is because they don't actually understand what they're doing. Somebody tells them it's a good idea, or they see an advert and they go, oh yeah, great, let's do it. That's what I should do, right? Rather than actually taking the time to seek advice if they don't know that they could seek advice. It's obviously a challenge around the cost of that as well. But to really understand and feel comfortable in purchasing financial products, I think kind of is synonymous with being or having sufficient financial kind of knowledge and education, I guess.
Yeah, from my side, I remember the pension mis-selling scandal. I even worked on the topic in 1998 for around a year, I think half time in my last company. And I mean, it was clearly the case that some people should not have moved out of the final salary schemes and bought a personal pension, not just to an actuary, but it should have been obvious to some reasonably educated person from the general public that this was a bad deal. You would lose contributions from another source even. So people didn't realize that this was happening. After that, we had the endowment mortgage mis-selling scandal. The PPI scandals currently cost around 40 billion in fines. I think there's an FCA website where every month another chunk of money is shown for fines that month. And it's around 300 or 400 million pounds per month even now. So we don't know when that's going to end. And I remember in one of my other working parties where I was a Life Research Committee representative, we referenced a survey carried out in the UK where the insurance industry was ranked bottom of all industries, or bottom of all areas, even below journalists and professions, which usually get a bad rap. So I think this just general drip of bad news, bad advice, fines, mistrust, bad reputation has created maybe a reputation we can't recover 100%, but we can at least start, I think.
I suppose just on that subject then, because I'll have to disclose I've worked for Equitable Life for 24 years until 2014. So I'm no stranger to mis-selling of one form or the other. In certain circumstances, if I reflect on that time, I can see that the industry and particular firms have not behaved appropriately, and therefore redress is in effect something that is a fair outcome to deal with the situation. However, I also am conscious that in that past time, there has been a case where the regulator has held companies to standards that are prevailing at the current time, but didn't apply at the point of sale. So they retrospectively applied those, and if you couldn't justify those standards, they then asked you to redress. So I guess in terms of the balance, I'm interested in your views in terms of what is fair levels of financial literacy, so that people make fair decisions around what they buy, and how do the obligations of firms fit into that, so that they are in effect clarifying the level of risks that policyholders are taking.
Yeah, I think we believe it would be better to have a situation where these bad events didn't happen, rather than let them happen and then apply a retrospective judgment, which is very costly to the industry. In terms of the level of financial literacy, I think I've got to get my thoughts in order here, but we do know that the basic level of financial literacy in the general public is very low. We do know that insurance has an asymmetry of information problem, in that the manufacturing and the distribution side knows more about what's going on in the product and the financials than the customer. And very often the customer is, I wouldn't say doing badly, but maybe doing worse out of all the three parties compared to the shareholder and the distributor. That can be the case. It can be a presumption that most people simply don't understand, I wouldn't say financial products, but even semi-complex financial products. That should be the level I think we should be looking at. The second point is, when I joined the working life in 1994, I joined a company where some of the products were still from the 70s, and they were incredibly simple. A unit-linked product where you could invest in one fund and there was no fund choice, or a traditional fund where you would have a bonus rate, and then traditional bonuses, you'd have illustrations, but there was a certain level of expectation around what you would get back. And I believe in the chase for yield, in the chase for customers, and in the chase to make yourself look different from your competitor in an ever more stratified business environment, the complexity in products has increased. The complexity of payments, the complexity of options and flexibility around the product. And in order for the shareholder to make their return in a reasonable way and still fund a reasonable commission payment, there are often these little features that the customer is never going to understand, but which provides a margin to the shareholder. And that might all be reasonable if the customer can understand very simply what they get in and what they get out in a reasonable way, including a worst case situation. But if they can't understand even that, then I don't think we're going to have a very satisfied customer at the end of the day. I don't know anything about an engine of a car, but I know what a car is and know how to drive a car. So I'm not saying that the customer has to understand the engine of the insurance products, but I believe at least what goes in, what comes out with a reasonable level of certainty, and in a worst case situation, what they can get back. I think that's a starting point on the information provision side, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, actually, because there's this, what's a complex product, what's a non-complex product, what do you expect, Joe Bloggs on the street to be able to understand and therefore purchase, invest in, or whatever. But a lot of it is to do, and we are getting better at this, a lot of it's to do with the way in which we communicate what something's doing. I think, as Chris said, if you can confidently say, okay, I understand what I'm paying for, what I'm going to get out of it, then great, that kind of feels like a decent level of knowledge. It's when people don't understand what they're purchasing, what the benefits really are, what they're paying for it, that we run into really big trouble. And I think we've probably encountered things in the past that's been a direct result of that.
Agree.
So I totally agree with what you said. I guess a couple of the people that are forwarding their views or questions have pointed out effectively, whilst we have simple contracts and complicated contracts, and there is a need for trust in imparting the right information so people can make informed choices with a reasonable sense of knowledge of the risks without actually having to understand how to be the equivalent of a heart surgeon to do that. If we look at comparable, or not comparable, but if we look at other examples of products, if you bought a packet of cigarettes, it would be incredibly obvious that packet of cigarettes is a huge detriment to your health and could result in lung cancer and other major medical outcomes. Do you think we're good enough, particularly in those complex contracts, are making it absolutely clear what are the risks in a short, digestible form? Because, you know, in some cases, those illustrations can be 8 pages long with lots of complicated information. And even if you make quite clear statements, quite often they can be very difficult to pick up for the uninitiated who may be faced with looking at 8 pages of gobbledygook.
I think it's a challenge, and I mean, going back to kind of one of the points that Chris made around, you know, what might happen in a worst case scenario, that's important. But I think some of the challenges with sort of illustrations sometimes is, yeah, you can have a model that says, oh, well, in this scenario, you're going to end up with £1 million, but in this scenario, you'll have nothing. So you'll either get nothing or £1 million. Cool. Hope that's okay. And that's, I don't know, you go, okay, great. What do I do with that sort of information? Yeah, challenging.
I think the worst case scenario, excluding default, is always an interesting one. At least it would uncover where you have some kind of protection or guarantee, excluding default of the company. In terms of complexity, I think the Insurance Distribution Directive and the sales processes around that do help a little bit. You have to have a target market for your product. You have to have a process in your company that ensures there is a target market for your product and a negative target market in some cases. And if you attack a target market and your customers within that target market, you have to look at the level of knowledge of the customer, the ability to bear risks. I think with this kind of knowledge, an advisor should be able to provide a product that meets the needs of the customer, and that the customer should be able to understand at least what they're getting back for the money they put in. I think when you're talking very complex financial products with very highly geared non-linear payouts with the most bizarre constructions imaginable, and I've seen products which it took an expert 5 reads of the benefit profile to understand what was going on. I would say that should not be sold to a retail customer unless there is something exceptional, a disclaimer, a signature of the customer, or evidence of a high level of financial literacy, something like a financial qualification, an accountant, an actuary, etc. So I think we have to think around these levels of protection as well, not just provision of information.
Thank you. And we've had quite a lot of questions around expenses themselves, I guess, from an insurance product point of view. 2 key observations are coming out here. One, if there's an improved financial literacy, won't that reduce the industry's opportunity for making profits, particularly at a time when profits are hard to come by, when returns are very low? Wouldn't that be a bit of a problem? And the other thing that's raised is the cost of bringing up the level of literacy in order for people to make informed choices will again have an impact on expenses and therefore returns on those policies. So could you just comment on both of those aspects of financial literacy and the impact they have on expenses?
Well, I think our view is if you have a more financially literate public, you'll have people who will be able to plan their financial resources on both the income side and the expense side better, and will have an awareness of the importance of saving for things like a rainy day and for saving for a pension, even if it's a little amount. So I believe there may be some pressure on margins in the sense that more financially savvy people may shop around for products which have a lower reduction in yield, for example. But I think the market would increase with the number of customers coming in and deciding that it makes sense to actually invest for the future and save for the future and protect their families. So I think there are trade-offs there. In terms of the costs of raising the level of financial literacy, if you want to do something good like this, it will cost money, but I think it will take time. So we're not talking about something that can be done this year or maybe even in the next 10 years. I know in Sweden, for example, financial literacy has been in the school education curriculum since 1920, and there was a very common cultural theme of having school savings clubs since around the 1880s. So, that's taken 140 years to get from that situation to where we are now. And very often the Nordic countries score very highly in financial literacy, as they do score highly in many other things. So I think this is something that will take time. And I think if we do it properly, it'll be worth the investment, but we can't expect within a very short time that people are going to be very financially literate. Let's put it like that.
I think as well, just to add to the margins and the expenses point, ultimately, if people know what they're sort of purchasing or buying into, then hopefully there will be fewer complaints, and so firms will be less likely to have to redress. Clients will go, I didn't understand, I invested in this, lost some money, and the FCA, rule that, you've got to make good. So that potentially could also balance out the cost of ensuring that, clients are more financially literate.
And we've had quite a few questions, I guess, in terms of if we look more widely from a geographic perspective around financial literacy. You've mentioned there some examples of some countries with good attitudes towards financial literacy. Do you think financial literacy potentially is a function of a culture thing in the first place? And I guess in relation to our attempt to change our cultures across a wide range of developed cultures so that there is more equality between the pay and rewards and outcomes for between the sectors and between different cultural groups within our society. Do you think there's a need to particularly focus financial literacy at some of those groups that are we hope will have a better outcome in terms of the share of the pie going forward, particularly in relation to females, which are expected to increase their share of the future wealth, but also culture within our own culture, different groups within that culture, and across the globe, if there's any examples of where that's been done well.
So that was a long question. I think there are probably several parts. One was around, is financial literacy a function of culture? This is not my area of expertise, but if culture is a function of education, then I assume that financial literacy will be in some form a function of the culture. There are clearly some cultures that are slightly more conservative and some which are not. And those which are slightly more conservative may put a value on financial literacy more than others. And I mentioned Scandinavia earlier. Norway, Sweden and Denmark always rank highest for financial literacy in the kind of global surveys that are being carried out by entities such as Standard & Poor's. And I mentioned Sweden with their long history of financial education being in the school curriculum and the school clubs. But in Denmark as well, I was looking at one of Denmark's largest savings bank. It's called Danske Bank. I think it's one of the largest banks in the Nordic region. And I was so impressed by the material that was available on that website, Danske Bank website, regarding financial literacy. They were providing incredible, very good material for children, adults, parents, and even teachers, with teaching resources, gamification, and apps for managing finances. So I was really impressed by what they were offering, and as a private bank. So I think financial literacy and culture are intertwined. That would be my expectation. I didn't quite catch the rest of the question on diversity. Did you catch that, Danny?
No.
Was this around, should we focus on certain groups more? Because, well, I think we mentioned the issue of vulnerable customers, and the framework should allow for them as well, rather than just educating them. I think we also mentioned women. The global survey carried out by Standard & Poor's found a very strong, across the world, feature that women tended to have lower levels of financial skill than men, even after adjusting for various other factors. And if that is the case, then I think we would probably need to do something about that. I'm not sure what or how. But in terms of making sure that doesn't emerge from the current young generation of people. I think starting very early in school and providing good quality financial literacy teaching to children in primary school and beyond with specialist teachers, that's very important. I think might help that in the long run as well. But I'm not sure I have a strong comment on the other issue.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we're coming up to the hour, so we only have time for one more question, although we are still getting a lot of questions, so the participation level is very high, and thank you for that. I guess this is a specific question in relation to the UK in particular. If we look at pensions in the past, we've seen a shift from defined benefit to defined contribution pension arrangement. With that has become quite a significant shift in terms of the risks that individuals are taking, and a lot of people have commented to say, do you think we did enough to demonstrate those risks to the people as they took them, and so that they are aware of the potential impact and outcomes of those risks? So clearly in relation to taking investment risk, longevity risk, etc. Do we feel in the pensions domain people are fully aware that they're taking those risks?
Good question. Actually, it links onto another working party I sit on, actually, where we're sort of looking more around sort of the retirement space, and I think there is a big gap, especially with sort of pension freedoms. It's just painted as this, oh, you've got the flexibility, it's amazing, especially with, you can get an annuity if you want, but you don't have to get an annuity. Why would you? Because everybody hates them, right? And people just kind of go, oh, that's brilliant, I can spend my money whatever way I want, without realizing actually, you've got to have enough money to last until you die. How long are you going to live for? People always underestimate their longevity. There's the whole sequence of returns challenge that you have, i.e. if you experience poor returns when you start withdrawing money from a DC pot, then that can have massive impacts on the longevity of your fund. And it's quite complicated to understand. Things like inflation as well. People quite often underestimate the impact that can have if you don't allow for it. And so it was this good news story about this additional flexibility, etc. But I was going to say you ended up downplaying the risks associated with having all that flexibility, but I'd almost say we almost ignored talking about it, or certainly the government did when they announced the whole pension freedoms piece. I think there's also, this is perhaps going a little bit off topic, but around kind of the shift from DB to DC pensions as well. Obviously, the benefits of a DB pension, you're going to get an income for the rest of your life. Your spouse will probably get, say, half what you were getting as well if you were to die before them. They're really, really powerful. With the sort of DC space that we're in now, it's great that people are contributing, into a pension, say through auto enrolment, but do people actually understand the level of savings they need to fund their retirement? I'm not sure they do. And they might just assume, oh, well, I'm paying whatever I'm being told to pay in, so that'll be fine. I can still get 50 grand a year when I retire, right, until I die. And again, this links back to potentially the education piece as well, around how much do I need, what are the risks associated with it, and so on.
Excellent. And I guess on that note, I did learn something from Martin Lewis's program on financial literacy the other week, and that was that the broad rule of thumb for putting away money for your retirement should really be taking your age at which you start to contribute, divide it by 2, and put that amount in percentage terms until you retire. So I thought that was quite a good ready reckoner, actually, and a very crude but very effective way of actually articulating how much you need to put in your pension scheme. Unfortunately, as somebody that's in their 50s, that's not such good news for me, because that's a large number to divide by 2. Anyway, I'd like to say thank you to both Danny and Chris for a very interesting paper, an interesting presentation, and for replying to the many questions that have come through the session itself. There are, like I say, there has been quite a lot of questions, so we will try and compile those and get some answers out to those and share those after this session. But I'd like to thank both Danny and Chris. Unfortunately, we can't do it in the normal way, which would be to applaud, but we will have to do a virtual applause at the current time and say thank you to you two, and thank you for everyone else for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Big thank you, Rob, for managing the meeting. We want to also thank Myri Russell for supporting our working party over the past couple of years, and also Nikki Lovely Lewis for giving us a lot of support in the past few months, and also for Gemma Smith for running the technicalities of the meeting so well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.